Halfway through, Walter Harland, a quiet Vietnam veteran, chains himself to a war memorial slated for demolition, sparking controversy in Klay County. Mocked as a relic in his faded uniform, he faces arrest and scorn from a community eager for progress. Yet, his silent protest stirs whispers of his past, heroic deeds buried in memory. As the courtroom trial unfolds, a revelation looms, poised to shatter perceptions. Will Walter's sacrifice be forgotten, or will his stand awaken a town to the weight of history? The tension builds, hinting at a truth that could redeem or break him. If Walter's story of courage and remembrance moved you, join us in honoring unsung heroes. Like, subscribe, and share to keep their stories alive. Your support fuels our mission to celebrate duty and sacrifice. Comment below about someone who inspired you. Let's salute them together. The courtroom buzzed with a restless hum, the air thick with anticipation and judgment. At the front, an elderly man shuffled in, his steps deliberate but unsteady, dressed in a military uniform that looked like it had been plucked from the dusty racks of a second-hand costume shop. The fabric was faded, its once crisp olive green dulled to a tired shade, and the metals pinned to his chest glinted faintly, tarnished by time. From the back row, a sharp voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "What's that old fool doing? Playing dress-up?" The words dripped with scorn, and a ripple of laughter followed, quick, biting, and utterly thoughtless. The crowd's eyes raked over the man's stooped shoulders, his stiff gait, the way his hands trembled slightly as he steadied himself. To them, he was a relic, a punchline, a nobody daring to parade in a uniform he surely hadn't earned. Not a single person rose to their feet. Not one voice spoke up to challenge the mockery. They all sat, smug in their dismissal, unaware that history was about to unfold before them. The judge, a woman with steel-gray hair and a face etched with years of hard decisions, sat at the bench, her expression unreadable. She opened the man's file, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn pages inside. The room fell silent as her eyes scanned the text. Then she paused. Her breath caught almost imperceptibly, and she stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. With a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her right hand in a crisp military salute, her gaze fixed on the old man. Her voice, steady but laced with reverence, broke the silence with just two words: "Sergeant Harland." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the courtroom. Every head turned, every smirk froze. In that moment, the people of Klay County, Kentucky, realized they weren't witnessing a trial. They were standing in the presence of a legend. Walter Harland was born in the tender embrace of spring, April 1943, in a weathered, clapboard farmhouse perched on the outskirts of Klay County. The house creaked under the weight of time and poverty, its walls bearing witness to a family's unyielding resilience. Walter was the youngest of five, a quiet boy with eyes that seemed to see beyond the rolling Appalachian hills that cradled his world. His childhood was a tapestry of simple joys and relentless toil, splashing in the icy waters of Dust Creek, hauling firewood through frostbitten mornings, and learning the unspoken language of survival. When he was 8, tragedy struck like a hammer. His father, a miner with calloused hands and a weary smile, was buried alive in a collapse deep beneath the earth. The loss carved a hollow space in Walter's heart, one he filled with a fierce determination to ease his mother's burden. His mother, Clara, was a woman forged in fire, with a spine as unyielding as the railroad spikes she likened herself to. She took in laundry from wealthier families, her hands raw from scrubbing, her face set in a quiet defiance that needed no words. She fed her children on meager scraps and taught them a grit that ran deeper than the coal veins beneath their land. Walter watched her, absorbing her strength, her silence, her refusal to bend under the weight of grief. He grew up carrying more than his share, chopping wood, mending fences, tending the small garden that kept them from starvation. He didn't complain. He didn't know how to. His heart swelled with a quiet pride, a sense that every blister, every ache, was a testament to his love for the family that shaped him. As a boy, Walter was a listener, not a talker. He'd sit on the sagging porch of the general store, his bare feet dangling, while old veterans spun tales of distant wars. Their voices, rough as gravel, carried stories of Normandy's blood-soaked beaches, Korea's frozen hills, and brothers who never returned. Walter soaked it all in, his young mind painting vivid pictures of courage and sacrifice. He never asked questions, but the stories took root in his soul, whispering to him of duty, of something larger than the narrow dirt roads of Klay County. By the time he turned 18, Walter felt a pull he couldn't name, a debt he owed to those voices, to the men whose names were etched in his memory like sacred scripture. In 1961, with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of resolve, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He didn't look back, though his mother's tear-streaked face haunted his dreams for years. Vietnam broke Walter in ways he never spoke of, reshaping him in the crucible of its jungles and battlefields. He served 2 tours from 1966 to 1971 with the 25th Infantry Division, his boots slogging through the mud of Kang Tree in the rice paddies near the Cambodian border. The war was a relentless beast, its jaws snapping at his sanity, his hope, his humanity. He saw friends torn apart by gunfire, their laughter silenced in an instant. He carried wounded men through torrents of rain, his muscles screaming, his mind numb. He stared into the eyes of enemies and saw, not monsters, but boys as scared as he was. Through it all, Walter fought with a quiet ferocity, driven by a loyalty to his brothers in arms that burned brighter than fear. He earned medals that most soldiers only dreamed of. A Silver Star for dragging a wounded comrade through a hail of bullets. A Bronze Star with a V for valor after holding a position against impossible odds. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds that left scars he hid beneath long sleeves. There were others too, half a dozen commendations that spoke of a courage so profound it defied words. But Walter carried them like burdens, not trophies. He kept no photographs from those years, no mementos to anchor him to the past. His walls bore no plaques, his shelves no folded flags. The war lived in his silences, in the faraway look that stole over his face on quiet evenings. Sitting on his porch, a glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand, he'd stare past the horizon, his mind drifting to places no one could follow. The jungles still whispered to him, their ghosts never far. When he came home, Walter was a stranger to the boy who'd left. The swagger of youth was gone, replaced by a limp and a quiet that clung to him like a second skin. He didn't chase glory or ambition. He took whatever work he could find, janitor, groundskeeper, handyman, jobs that let him move through the world unnoticed. Eventually, he settled into a steady role maintaining Klay County's municipal buildings. The courthouse, with its creaking floors and chipped paint, became his domain. The library, where children whispered and pages rustled, bore his care in its polished shelves. The civic theater, small but proud, gleamed under his quiet attention. Every task, no matter how small, was a vow he kept to himself, to leave the world a little better than he found it. But there was one place Walter held sacred, Memorial Grove Park. At its heart stood a weathered stone monument, its surface etched with the names of every Klay County soul lost to war since World War I. The lettering was faint, the base cracked, the flagpole leaning slightly askew. To others, it was just a relic, forgotten by all but the wind. To Walter, it was a shrine. Every Saturday, even after retirement, he'd make the pilgrimage. He'd clear fallen leaves, trim the grass with meticulous care, scrub bird droppings from the stone until it shone. He'd straighten the flagpole, his hands steady despite their tremor, his heart heavy with the weight of names he'd never forget. Each task was a prayer, a quiet act of devotion to the brothers he'd lost, to the voices that still echoed in his dreams. Back in the courtroom, the judge's salute hung in the air, a moment frozen in time. Walter stood still, his weathered face betraying nothing, though his heart thundered in his chest. He hadn't come here seeking recognition. He'd come because the town had called him to testify in a minor dispute, something about land boundaries near the park he loved. He'd worn the uniform not for show, but because it was the only thing that felt right, a final nod to the man he'd been, the man he still was. The laughter, the sneers had stung, but he'd borne them as he'd borne so much else, with a silence that spoke louder than words. The crowd's faces now burned with shame, their eyes darting to the floor, to each other, anywhere but at Walter. They saw him now, truly saw him, not as a frail old man, but as a giant whose shadow stretched across decades. The judge lowered her hand, her voice steady as she recounted the file's contents. Dates, missions, medals, sacrifices. Each word was a hammer, reshaping the room's understanding of the man before them. Walter's chest tightened, not with pride, but with a weary ache. He didn't want their awe, their apologies. He wanted only to go back to his park, to his quiet, to the names carved in stone. As the judge sat, the courtroom remained hushed, the weight of history pressing down on every soul. Walter Harland, the boy from Dust Creek, the soldier from Kangtree, the caretaker of Klay County's heart, stood tall in his faded uniform. He was no joke, no relic. He was a testament to a courage that didn't shout, a duty that didn't waver, a love that didn't fade. And in that moment, Klay County knew they'd never look at him or themselves the same way again. Walter Harland's boots crunched softly against the dew-kissed grass of Memorial Grove Park, a place that held more than memories for him. It was a sanctuary. Every week for 20 years, he'd made this pilgrimage at dawn, his hands brushing over the tiny American flags left by school children, their bright colors faded by time and weather. He came alone, a solitary figure in the quiet morning, never seeking praise or recognition. If anyone ever asked why he kept returning, Walter would just shrug, his weathered face betraying little. They held their post, he'd mutter, his voice low and steady. Reckon I can hold mine. To him, the war memorial wasn't just a slab of stone in a small-town park. It was hallowed ground, a sacred ledger of names, brothers in arms, friends, and strangers who'd become family in the crucible of war. Each name etched into the granite was a life, a story, a sacrifice that weighed heavier than the paving stones beneath his feet. The park itself had grown quiet over the years, overlooked by younger folks who hurried past without a glance. But for Walter, every visit was a roll call, a way to keep those names alive through his presence, his unspoken vow. It was the only place he ever let his guard down, where the stoic mask he wore for the world slipped, and silent tears traced the lines of his face. Those moments of vulnerability were his alone, shared only with the stone and the ghosts it honored. So when a city notice appeared one spring morning, stapled to a tree near the memorial, announcing plans for redevelopment and modernization, Walter felt a jolt deep in his chest. The words were clinical, detached. Remove aging war memorial to create space for open-use lawn. No relocation, no replacement, just erasure. The idea of a skate park and splash pad replacing the monument felt like a betrayal, a line cross that he couldn't ignore. For the first time in decades, Walter didn't just nod and fade into the shadows. He stood tall, resolve hardening in his bones. Everything that followed, the courtroom, the judge, the salute, sprang from that single, unshakable decision to hold his post. It all started quietly, as bad ideas often do, buried in the fine print of a city council agenda few bothered to read. The Klay County Beautification and Modernization Project was pitched as a gift to the community. Brighter lights, smoother walkways, a splash pad for kids, and food trucks on weekends. The presentation was slick, full of glossy drone shots and smiling families, peppered with buzzwords like revitalization and future-facing design. But tucked near the bottom of the proposal was a single line that stopped Walter cold. The memorial, with its fading names, names he'd watched weather through seasons, names he'd traced with trembling fingers, was to be torn down. No plan to preserve it, no mention of the men it honored. Just gone, replaced by a patch of grass for open use. Those names were Walter's brothers, his men, some older, some younger, all etched into his soul. He'd never let them be forgotten. Not while he still drew breath. At first, Walter didn't raise a fuss. He wasn't one for speeches or grand gestures. He showed up to a council meeting, sitting in the back row, his flannel shirt and worn work boots out of place among the polished suits and laptops. He listened patiently as they droned on about shade structures and QR codes for digital history. His heart pounded, but he kept his face still, hands clasped tightly in his lap. When the floor opened for public comment, he rose, his steps deliberate, and approached the microphone. His voice was calm but firm. "What's going to happen to the memorial, Tham?" he asked, eyes scanning the council members. A young staffer, barely looking up from her notes, replied, We're considering a digital tribute online. The stone's outdated. It doesn't fit the modern park experience. The words landed like a slap. Outdated. To Walter, that memorial was timeless, a testament to lives cut short, to promises kept. The dismissal stung and something inside him shifted. A quiet fury, a resolve he hadn't felt since his days in uniform. The next morning, before the first light broke over the horizon, Walter returned to the park. He wore his old army uniform, the fabric loose on his frame, softened by years in a closet. The medals pinned to his chest, tarnished but heavy with meaning, glinted faintly as he approached the memorial. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He knelt at the base of the stone, wrapping a thick steel chain around himself and the monument, the cold metal biting into his skin. With a soft click, he locked it, then dropped the key into a nearby storm drain, watching it vanish with a finality that felt right. He sat there, back against the stone, feeling the names behind him like a chorus of voices urging him on. This was his stand, his line in the sand. By mid-morning, the scene had drawn attention. A jogger snapped a photo, and soon images of Walter, gray-haired, chained, defiant, spread across social media. Captions varied. Old man protests demolition. Veteran chained to war monument. Some comments, mostly from older locals who remembered the memorial's unveiling, were supportive, their words warm with gratitude. But others were cruel. One post sneered, "Delusional Vietnam vet throwing a tantrum. Let him play soldier somewhere else." The words cut, but Walter didn't see them. He sat still, eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind replaying memories of jungles, gunfire, and faces he'd never see again. By noon, city officials arrived, their polished shoes clicking on the path. Local police followed, their radios crackling. They asked him to leave, their voices firm but cautious. Walter didn't move. They warned him of arrest, and he nodded, accepting the consequence without a word. When they cut the chain, the sound of metal snapping echoed in his ears, but he stood tall as they lifted him to his feet. He offered no resistance, only a quiet dignity that silenced the crowd gathering around. Walter Harland stood amidst the dwindling crowd, his weathered hands gripping the edges of a faded protest sign. The city's bulldozers loomed in the distance, their engines growling like impatient beasts ready to devour the park, a place that held more than grass and trees for him. It was a sacred ground, a quiet monument to the names etched in his heart, comrades whose laughter and cries still echoed in his dreams. As the police cruiser pulled away, its red and blue lights slicing through the morning haze, a voice from the crowd pierced the air. "Let go of the past, old man." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they dismissed the weight of what he carried. Walter's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a deep, aching sorrow. He wanted to shout back, to make them understand that the past wasn't just history, it was the blood and breath of men who never came home. But he stayed silent, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the park's trees swayed in defiance of the machines. That evening, the local news flickered on Walter's small television, the anchor's voice bright and detached, as if she were announcing a summer festival. "Vietnam veteran arrested for disrupting park development plans," she chirped, her smile unwavering. The city pushes forward with progress, undeterred by a small group of vocal protesters. They painted him as a stubborn old man, a fossil clinging to a world that no longer existed. The word relic cut deeper than the handcuffs that had briefly bound his wrists earlier that day. Walter sat in his worn armchair, the weight of the broadcast sinking into him. No one had asked why he stood in front of those bulldozers. No one cared to know the names he fought for. Names that weren't just letters on a memorial, but faces, voices, promises made under a jungle canopy. The dismissal hurt more than the arrest, more than the jeering headlines. It was a betrayal, a quiet erasure of the men he'd sworn to remember. If the world could pave over their memory without a second thought, what hope was there for the living to be heard? In the stillness of his modest bedroom, Walter knelt before the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. It was an old thing, its surface scratched and faded, yet it stood resolute, guarding decades of memory. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the weight of grief had grown too heavy to carry alone. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid, releasing a faint scent of aged wood and the lingering trace of his late wife's tobacco. The aroma was a ghost, stirring memories of her gentle touch, her quiet strength. Inside, folded with care, lay his old uniform, olive drab, softened by time but still whole, as if it too refused to surrender. On top rested a fragile slip of paper, its edges yellowed but the ink still clear. In his wife's familiar handwriting were the words, "You came home, that's all I needed." Walter's throat tightened as he read it, his mind flooding with images of her smile, the way she'd held him when the nightmares came. He missed her fiercely, her absence a wound that time had only dulled, not healed. He ran his calloused fingers over the uniform's fabric, its texture thinner than he remembered. Or perhaps it was he who had changed. Older now, leaner, his body no longer the sturdy frame of youth. The patches were still there, sewn tight. The 25th Infantry's Tropic Lightning insignia on the shoulder, a bold reminder of the jungles he'd survived. The sergeant's stripes on the sleeve, earned through sweat and sacrifice. Beneath the folded pants, in a small wooden box, lay his bronze star and purple heart, their metal surfaces dulled but heavy with meaning. Walter eased himself onto the edge of the bed, his joints protesting with a familiar ache. Time had its own discipline, one that no soldier could outrun. Dressing in the uniform was a slow, deliberate act. The shirt hung loose in places, tight in others, his body no longer the shape it had been. His back, once ramrod straight, now curved slightly under the weight of years. Still he buttoned each button with care, tucked in the hem, and cinched the belt, each motion a quiet act of devotion. In the hallway mirror, Walter faced a stranger. Not the brash 26-year-old who'd leapt from helicopters into the sweltering chaos of war, but a man with silver threading through his hair, lines etched deep across his brow. His eyes, though, remained unchanged, tired but piercing, carrying the names of the fallen like a sacred ledger. He reached for his medals, brushing them gently with a soft cloth. They wouldn't shine like they once had, but that wasn't the point. The act of polishing was a ritual, a way to honor the men behind the medal. He polished his boots next, their soles worn thin from years of marching, both in jungles and in memory. He clipped his nails, combed his thinning hair, and shaved with deliberate strokes, not for vanity, but for respect, for the promise he'd made to never forget. His granddaughter Emily slipped into the room, her sneakers silent on the hardwood floor. At 16, she was sharp-witted and fiercely opinionated, her eyes always sparking with curiosity or defiance. But when she saw Walter in his uniform, she froze, her usual chatter stilled. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice soft with awe, "you look like you stepped out of one of those old war movies." Her words carried a mix of admiration and disbelief, as if she were seeing him for the first time, not just as her grandfather, but as a man who'd lived a life she could barely imagine. Walter's lips curved into a faint smile, his heart warmed by her presence. "Just a man going to court, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet resolve. "I'll come with you," she offered, stepping closer, her eyes searching his. "You shouldn't be alone." For a moment he wavered, touched by her loyalty, but he shook his head. "Not today, honey. This one's mine to face." Emily nodded, sensing the weight of his words, the unspoken sacredness of his mission. Later that night, Walter placed the small box of medals beside his cane on the nightstand. He turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, but sleep eluded him. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a restless sound that mirrored the memories stirring in his mind. Flashes of gunfire, the weight of a friend's body in his arms, the promises made in the dark. Tomorrow he would walk into that courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a soldier, still honoring the oath he'd taken decades ago. The weight of those names, those lives, pressed against his chest, but it was a burden he carried willingly. The double doors of the Klay County courthouse groaned as they swung open just after 9 in the morning. Walter Harland stepped inside, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor. Each step was deliberate, measured, his body moving with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced far worse than judgment. The uniform, though old, fit him like a second skin, its weight both a comfort and a reminder. He stood alone, but he carried an army within him. The names, the faces, the promises that no bulldozer could bury. His heart beat steady, his eyes clear. ready to speak for those who could not. Walter Harland's boots echoed off the cold courthouse tiles, each heavy step a testament to a life of service now reduced to a spectacle. His uniform, meticulously pressed and adorned with medals that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, couldn't mask the burden of decades that clung to him like a shadow. The weight wasn't just in the fabric or the polished brass. It was in the memories each ribbon represented. Nights spent in foreign lands, comrades lost, promises kept. As he walked past the first row of seats, his shoulders squared, despite the ache in his joints, two teenagers exchanged a smug glance. "What, is it Veterans Day already?" one whispered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Nah, more like cosplay hour," the other shot back, already pulling out his phone with a grin that betrayed his eagerness to capture the moment. "Let's see this faker get roasted," he muttered, tilting the camera toward Walter as he settled at the defendant's table, his heart heavy with the sting of their words. The whispers didn't fade. They grew, a chorus of judgment weaving through the courtroom. "He's really wearing that to guilt-trip the judge. Looks like he dressed for his own funeral." In a way, Walter had dressed for a funeral, not of his body, but of the ideals he'd fought for, the history he'd chained himself to preserve. The murmurs buzzed like flies, each one a pinprick to Walter's pride. He sat rigid, his weathered hands clasped tightly on the table, his eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench. Inside, his chest burned, not with shame, but with the effort to hold back the tide of frustration and sorrow. Every clink of his medals as he shifted was a reminder of battles won, of lives saved, of a country he'd believed in. Yet here, in this sterile room, those sacrifices were reduced to a punchline, a prop in a drama he hadn't chosen to star in. The teenagers' laughter, the sideways glances from the gallery, it all cut deeper than he'd ever admit, slicing into the quiet dignity he'd carried for decades. Elliot Green, the public defender assigned to Walter's case, swept into the courtroom 5 minutes before the gavel was set to fall. Young, barely out of law school, with a tie slightly askew and a stack of papers under his arm, Elliot's eyes landed on Walter's uniform and widened in disbelief. "You wore that?" he asked, his tone sharp, not bothering to sit or lower his voice. The disapproval in his gaze was unmistakable, as if Walter's choice was a personal affront. Walter met his eyes, steady and unyielding. "I did," he said simply, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of conviction. Elliot shook his head, a flicker of exasperation crossing his face. "Not ideal, Mr. Harland. Judges want remorse, not a performance. I'd suggest a no-contest plea. Say you're sorry, and I might get you off with a fine and a few hours of community service." Walter's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching slightly as he fought the urge to argue. "I won't apologize," he said, each word deliberate, a quiet rebellion against the idea that his stand was something to regret. Elliot sighed, monk and heavy, already checking his watch, as if Walter's case was just another box to tick. "Then don't expect miracles," he muttered, turning away to shuffle through his notes, his disinterest palpable. Walter watched him go, a pang of disappointment settling in his gut, not for himself, but for the system that had assigned him a defender who saw his fight as a lost cause before it even began. As the bailiff called the room to order, the judge's absence left space for the gallery's hum to swell. Heads turned, eyes lingering on Walter with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Some were city employees, their fate is set in bureaucratic neutrality, while others belonged to the development team pushing the new park project. Young professionals clutching glossy folders filled with renderings of splash pads, bike lanes, and community gardens. A woman in a sharp navy suit, her hair pulled back tightly, leaned toward a colleague and pointed at Walter. "It's honestly pathetic," she said, her voice low, but clear enough to carry. "Clinging to the past like this, as if history has to block progress." Her words landed like a slap, and Walter's heart twisted, not because he doubted his cause, but because the dismissal felt so casual, so thoughtless. To them, he was a relic, a stubborn old man standing in the way of their shiny new vision. But to Walter, the structure he'd chained himself to wasn't just a monument. It was a piece of his soul, a tangible link to the sacrifices of those who'd stood beside him. Tearing it down wasn't progress. It was erasure. The city attorney, Margot Kinley, rose with the poise of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. In her 40s, dressed in a slate gray suit that matched the cool precision of her voice, she exuded confidence as she addressed the judge's empty bench, knowing her words would soon carry weight. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured but firm, "the city's case is clear and straightforward. The defendant willfully disrupted a public space during an active development project, ignored lawful orders from law enforcement, and physically chained himself to a structure scheduled for legal demolition." She paused, her eyes flicking toward Walter, not with malice but with a detached professionalism that felt even colder. "While we deeply respect the contributions of all former servicemen, we cannot permit one individual's personal beliefs to obstruct improvements that benefit the entire community. This was not a lawful protest rooted in legal principle. It was a disruption driven by nostalgia." Her words hung in the air, each one a calculated cut, framing Walter's act as selfish, sentimental, obsolete. Inside, Walter's pulse quickened, his restraint a dam holding back a flood of anger and grief. Nostalgia? No. It was loyalty to the men who'd never come home, to the promises etched in stone, to the truth that history wasn't a barrier, but a foundation. The judge, still absent, left the room in a limbo of whispers and sidelong glances. Elliot Green stood, his posture slouched, his voice a half-hearted mumble as he requested leniency. His lack of preparation was painfully obvious, his words stumbling over each other, devoid of passion or conviction. Walter sat silent, his hands still folded, his breathing deliberate. He wouldn't beg, wouldn't bend. The heat crawling up his neck wasn't shame. It was the fire of holding fast to what he knew was right, even when no one else seemed to care. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a phone chimed, sharp and intrusive. The same teenager from earlier, his face lit by the glow of his screen, was live streaming, his voice a cruel whisper. "Bet he bought those medals off eBay," he snickered, and laughter rippled down the bench behind him, light but cutting. Walter didn't flinch, didn't turn, but the words pierced him, sinking into the raw, tender place where his pride lived. It wasn't just the mockery, it was the assumption that his life, his service, could be so easily dismissed. The ache wasn't in his bones, it was in his soul, a deep, gnawing pain born of sacrifice met with scorn, of silence mistaken for weakness. Yet he sat tall, his gaze steady, because Walter Harland knew his worth, even if the world had forgotten how to measure it. In the harsh glare of the courtroom lights, Walter Harland stood rigid, his outdated army uniform clinging to his frame like a relic of a forgotten era. The murmurs and stifled laughter from the gallery gnawed at him, each whisper a fresh wound. He was no longer the decorated sergeant who'd faced the jungles of Vietnam with unyielding courage. Here, in Klay County Circuit Court, he was reduced to a caricature, a punchline and a cruel joke no one bothered to defend him against. Shame burned in his chest, hotter than any firefight he'd endured, and the weight of their judgment pressed down until he felt small, insignificant, utterly alone. Judge Miriam Langston, perched behind the towering bench, was the picture of judicial poise. For nearly 20 years, she'd ruled this courtroom with a steady hand, her reputation built on precision and an unshakable calm. Her docket flowed with mechanical efficiency, no theatrics, no delays. Justice under her gavel was a quiet, orderly affair. But that morning, as the courtroom buzzed with restless energy, something shifted. During a brief pause in the proceedings, she flipped through the defendant's file, her sharp eyes scanning the familiar forms, incident reports, city statements, grainy photographs, and legal motions. She'd seen countless cases like this one, petty disputes dressed up as matters of law. Yet, buried on the final page, a single line stopped her cold. Walter Harland, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 25th Infantry Division, Vietnam. Her pen hovered, frozen midair. Charlie Company. The name struck like a bell, resonating deep within her, stirring memories she'd long kept locked away. Her breath caught, and for a moment the courtroom faded. The whispers, the shuffling papers, the impatient sighs, all drowned out by the echo of that name. She stared at the page, half expecting the letters to dissolve if she dared to blink. Slowly, deliberately, she closed the file, her fingers lingering on its edge, as if it held more than just paper. Her gaze lifted, settling on the man at the defense table. Walter sat alone, his shoulders hunched, his face etched with the weariness of a life carried too long. She saw him anew, not as the stiff, aging figure in a faded uniform, nor as the public nuisance the city's lawyers had branded him, but as a thread woven into the same tapestry of loss and duty she'd borne silently for decades. "Mr. Harland," she said, her voice steady but infused with a quiet intensity that hadn't been there moments before. The courtroom, still humming with subdued chatter, fell silent, heads turned, curious and confused. Walter's eyes snapped up, startled to hear his name spoken with such directness. Guarded but respectful, he nodded. "May I ask you a question?" she continued, her tone measured yet carrying an undercurrent of something deeper, something personal. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice rough but firm, betraying none of the turmoil roiling inside. He braced himself, unsure what this judge, with her piercing gaze, could want from a man like him. "Were you deployed with Charlie Company during Operation Iron Wind, June 1969? The question sliced through the room, sharp and unexpected, like a blade flashing in the dark. The city attorney, Margot Kinley, frowned, her perfectly manicured brows knitting in bewilderment. Elliot Green, the overworked public defender, paused mid-scribble, his pen hovering as he glanced between the judge and his client. Spectators exchanged puzzled looks, sensing the proceedings had veered off their predictable course. But Walter felt the weight of those words instantly. They reached into the depths of his soul, stirring memories he'd buried under years of silence. His back straightened, an old soldier's instinct kicking in, and his chest tightened as if the air had grown thin. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within. "I was squad leader, 2nd platoon." He hesitated, then added softer, "I don't usually talk about it. Nobody ever asks." Judge Langston held his gaze, her expression unreadable, but her eyes alive with something raw, something unguarded. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "My father," she said, her voice softening, "was Captain Benjamin Langston, commanding officer of Charlie Company." Walter's breath hitched, his lips parting as if the name had knocked the wind from him. Captain Langston. The words carried him back to the sweltering jungles, to the crack of gunfire, and the weight of lives resting on every decision. "Captain Langston," he echoed, his voice low, thick with reverence and memory. "He was a good man, ma'am. The kind you'd follow into hell itself, no questions asked." His hands, clasped tightly on the table, trembled faintly, betraying the emotion he fought to contain. "He never came home," Judge Langston said, her words quiet but heavy with a grief that had shaped her life. "I was 3 years old." Silence descended, blanketing the courtroom in a profound, almost sacred stillness. The earlier whispers and smirks were gone, replaced by a collective reverence no one dared break. Margot Kinley shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by unease, her smirk erased by the weight of the moment. Judge Langston's fingers brushed the closed file, a faint tremor betraying the composure she'd honed over decades. "My mother always said he spoke of his men like they were family," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the weeks before that operation, he wrote her letters. One mentioned a sergeant named Harland, someone he trusted, someone who kept his men steady when the world was falling apart." Walter's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening as he fought the tide of emotion rising within him. He hadn't heard that name spoken with such care in years, hadn't dared to revisit those days when he'd led his squad through chaos, when every step could have been their last. The memory of Captain Langston, his calm resolve, his unwavering leadership, flooded back, and with it, the guilt of surviving when so many hadn't. He couldn't speak, couldn't find words to bridge the chasm between that jungle and this courtroom. But his silence spoke volumes, his clenched fists and slow, deliberate blinks revealing a struggle fiercer than any battle he'd faced. The courtroom remained hushed, the air thick with the shared weight of their history. For Walter, the mockery of moments ago dissolved, replaced by a fragile sense of recognition, of being seen not as a nuisance but as a man who'd carried the same burdens as the judge before him. For Miriam, the file on her desk was no longer just a case number. It was a piece of her father's legacy, a connection to the man she'd lost before she could know him. In that quiet, fleeting moment, they were no longer judge and defendant, but two souls bound by the echoes of Charlie Company, standing together in the shadow of a war that had never truly let them go. The courtroom air hung thick with tension, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your breath catch. Judge Amelia Langston sat at the bench, her hands folded tightly, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed the storm of emotion swirling within. She inhaled deeply, as if drawing strength from the very air, steadying herself for what she was about to say. Her eyes, sharp yet softened by grief, locked onto Walter Harland, the man seated before her, his weathered face etched with lines that told stories he'd never shared. "You were with him," she said, her voice low but deliberate, each word carrying the weight of a daughter's longing. "You were with my father at the end." Walter, a man whose quiet demeanor belied the battles he'd fought, nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly as memories he'd buried deep clawed their way to the surface. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but steady, like gravel underfoot. "It was near a river crossing in Vietnam. We came under heavy fire, bullets snapping through the air, explosions shaking the ground. Your father, Captain Langston, he ordered us to fall back. But he stayed behind, covering our retreat, giving us a chance to make it out." Walter's eyes dropped to the floor, his jaw tightening as the scene replayed in his mind. The case, the smoke, the crack of gunfire. "I saw him go down. Tried to get to him, but the enemy was too close, the fire too heavy. We couldn't reach him in time." Amelia's throat tightened and her voice cracked, just once betraying the grief she'd carried for decades. She swallowed hard, forcing the lump in her throat back down. "Thank you," she whispered, her words trembling with a gratitude that felt too small for the sacrifice described. "Thank you for trying." The courtroom fell into a profound silence, the kind that presses against your ears, heavy and unbroken. Even the young man in the gallery, who moments ago had been fidgeting with his phone, recording the proceedings with a smirk, had stilled. His screen was dark now, his attention riveted on the exchange. In that single, fragile moment, the room transformed. This was no longer just a trial, no longer a case to be argued and filed away. It was a reunion, a daughter grappling with the ghost of her father, and a soldier who had stood by his side in his final, selfless act. Walter sat motionless, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, as if the weight of that day still pressed down on him. He hadn't wanted to speak of it, hadn't wanted to dredge up the pain of loss, the guilt of survival. But Amelia's words had cracked something open in him, a wound that had never fully healed. He could still see Captain Langston's face, resolute and fearless, as he waved them back, his voice cutting through the K. "Go, I've got this!" Walter had replayed that moment 1,000 times, wondering if he could have done more, if he could have changed the outcome. Now, facing the captain's daughter, he felt exposed, raw, as if the courtroom lights were shining straight into his soul. The silence was shattered by a faint sound from the back of the room, a chair scraping against the polished floor, followed by the soft click of a cane. Every head turned as a figure rose, slow and unsteady, from the back row. He was tall, though age had stooped his frame, his face weathered like an old map, creased with the lines of a life hard-lived. His flannel shirt was tucked neatly into faded jeans, and his silver hair was combed with care, a quiet dignity in his appearance despite the tremble in his hands as he gripped his wooden cane. He stood there for a moment, gathering himself, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low and gravelly, but carrying a strength that demanded attention. "May I speak?" Amelia's gaze flicked to the bailiff, who hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio as he assessed the situation. He glanced at Walter, then back at the stranger before nodding slightly. Amelia's eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. "State your name for the court," she said, her tone formal, but curious. "Emmett Graves," the man replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "U.S. Army, retired. Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, Vietnam. I served with Walter Harland." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of surprise and intrigue. The city attorney, who had been slouched in his chair, sat up straighter, his pen pausing mid-scribble. Even the spectators, who had been whispering among themselves, fell silent, their curiosity piqued by this unexpected voice from the past. Emmett moved toward the front of the courtroom, each step deliberate, his cane tapping softly against the floor. The limp in his gait spoke of old wounds, of battles fought and survived, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. When he reached the witness stand, he didn't wait for permission to speak. His gaze locked onto Walter, and he pointed a trembling finger. "That man," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "saved my life." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emmett paused, drawing a deep breath, as if pulling the memory from the depths of his soul. "It was 1969, Quang Tri Province," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "We were ambushed, caught in a kill zone with no cover. Bullets were tearing through the air, mortar rounds exploding so close you could feel the heat. I took shrapnel in both legs, went down hard in a rice paddy, unable to move. I was sure that was it. My last moments, face down in the mud, praying to God not to let me die like that." His voice wavered, and he turned to face Amelia, his eyes glistening. And then Walter came back for me. Gasps and murmurs swelled through the courtroom, a collective intake of breath as the weight of his words settled over the room. Walter sat frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if refusing to meet Emmett's gaze. He hadn't expected this. Not Emmett, not here, not after all these years. The memories flooded back unbidden. The heat, the screams, the weight of Emmett's limp body slung over his shoulder as he ran, his own blood mixing with the mud and sweat. He'd pushed through the pain, driven by a promise he'd made to his squad. No one gets left behind. Emmett reached into his back pocket, his movements slow and reverent, and pulled out a folded photograph, its edges curled and yellowed with age. He unfolded it carefully, as if it were a sacred relic, and held it up for the room to see. "This is us," he said, his voice breaking, "the day before that mission. Me and Sergeant Harland. Just kids, barely out of our teens, standing in front of a chopper, arms around each other, grinning like we didn't know what was coming." The photo showed two young men in dusty fatigues, their faces lit with the reckless optimism of youth, their smiles wide despite the danger that loomed. The courtroom leaned forward, straining to see the faded image, a snapshot of a moment frozen in time. "I've never forgotten," Emmett said, his voice thick with tears. "Walter never spoke of it, never asked for a medal, never wanted the spotlight. But I'm here to say it now. He's a hero. Always has been." He turned to Walter, his eyes brimming with gratitude and something deeper. Loyalty, brotherhood, a bond forged in fire. "You kept your promise, Sarge. All these years, you still kept it." In that moment, the courtroom shifted irrevocably. The mocking whispers that had filled the room earlier dissolved into silence. The dismissive glances cast at Walter, the quiet man who had seemed unremarkable, turned to awe. For the first time since the trial began, Walter Harland was seen, not as a defendant, not as a name on a docket, but as a man who had carried the weight of others' lives on his shoulders, who had walked through hell and come out the other side, not for glory, but because it was right. Amelia's eyes glistened as she looked at him, her father's memory alive in the stories of these men, and for a fleeting moment, she felt closer to him than she had in years. The courtroom felt like a cathedral, heavy with a silence that pressed against every heart in the room. All eyes were fixed on the figure at the center, an elderly man in a worn military uniform, its faded fabric a testament to decades of quiet endurance. Sergeant Walter Harland wasn't just an old man standing before the bench. He was a soldier, a beacon of sacrifice, a living echo of a war the world had tried to tuck away in history books. His presence alone seemed to demand reverence, and the room obeyed. No one reached for their phones to scroll mindlessly. No one dared whisper or shift in their seat. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Judge Miriam Langston returned from the recess, her steps measured, her face etched with a solemnity that made the crowd lean forward. In her hands, she carried a thin beige folder, its edges frayed and corners softened by time. It wasn't part of the original court record, and yet it seemed to radiate a quiet power, as if it held secrets too heavy for the polished legal documents stacked neatly on the clerk's desk. She settled at the bench, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on the folder. "This," she said, her voice low but resonant, tapping the folder once with a deliberate finger, "contains official documentation from the Department of the Army. I requested Sergeant Walter Harland's full service records during the recess." She opened the folder, and the faint creak of its spine seemed to echo in the stillness. As she began to read, her voice was steady, but it carried a depth of respect that felt almost sacred. "Sergeant Walter Harland, United States Army, 25th Infantry Division. 2 combat tours in Vietnam. His awards and commendations include the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Bronze Star with valor, 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in combat, and multiple unit citations for exceptional service under enemy fire." Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the room, stirring emotions that had long been buried. The judge paused, her eyes lingering on the page, giving the weight of those honors time to settle in the hearts of everyone listening. In that moment, Walter Harland stood alone in his thoughts, his weathered hands clasped tightly before him. He didn't look up, didn't meet the eyes of the crowd. His gaze was locked on a single point on the floor, as if staring into a memory only he could see. The lines on his face told stories of jungles and gunfire, of comrades lost and promises kept. Inside, his heart churned with a storm of emotions. Pride, yes, but also a deep, aching sorrow for the men who never came home, whose names were carved into the monument at the heart of this trial. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this, not as a hero. For decades, he'd carried his service quietly, letting it live in the shadows of his everyday life. Now, under the courtroom's unflinching light, he felt exposed, vulnerable, yet oddly resolute. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about the names, the ones etched in stone, the ones he'd fought to honor. Judge Langston's voice broke the silence again, pulling him back to the present. On June 17th, 1969, during Operation Iron Wind, Sergeant Harland crossed open terrain multiple times under direct enemy fire to recover wounded soldiers. Despite sustaining injuries himself, he coordinated the evacuation of his men and established a defensive perimeter, directly saving the lives of 7 soldiers. The words painted a vivid picture in the minds of those listening. A young Walter, bloodied but unyielding, dragging his brothers to safety as bullets tore through the air. The judge's tone softened, but her reverence grew sharper. His actions were not the work of a moment's courage, but a sustained act of duty, a testament to the man he was and still is. Those closest to Walter noticed the slight tremble in his shoulders, a subtle crack in his stoic facade. His chest tightened with the weight of memories, screams of the wounded, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the unbearable heat of that day in '69. He'd never spoken of it, not to his family, not to the few friends he'd kept over the years. To him, it wasn't bravery. It was just what needed to be done. But now, hearing his actions laid bare in this hallowed room, he felt the sting of recognition, a bittersweet acknowledgement that threatened to unravel the walls he'd built around those memories. The judge closed the folder with a deliberate slowness, her fingers lingering on its surface as if reluctant to let it go. She lifted her eyes to meet Walter's, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink to just the two of them. This court recognizes that Sergeant Harland's actions, both then and now, were acts of duty, not disruption, she said, her voice carrying a quiet fire. His protest was not rebellion. It was remembrance. It was respect. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. In light of this man's service, his testimony, and the broader context this case has illuminated, all charges against Sergeant Walter Harland are hereby dismissed. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom, a release of tension that felt almost tangible. Relief washed over the spectators. But for Walter, it was more complex, a mix of gratitude and unease. He hadn't come here seeking vindication. He'd come to protect the monument, to ensure the names of his fallen brothers weren't erased for the sake of a new parking lot or shopping center. The dismissal was a victory, but it felt hollow without the larger promise that those names would endure. Judge Langston wasn't finished. Her voice grew firmer, commanding the room's attention once more. Furthermore, this court issues a formal judicial recommendation to the Klay County Council that the monument in Memorial Grove Park be designated a protected historical site. Its presence is not a hindrance to progress. It is the foundation of it. The words were a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. The monument, a weathered slab of granite bearing the names of the fallen, was more than stone. It was a sacred trust, a reminder of the cost of freedom. The judge's recommendation wasn't just a suggestion, it was a challenge to the county to honor its past. There was no dramatic gavel slam, no theatrical gesture to punctuate the moment. Just a room full of people, each grappling with the weight of what had nearly been lost. The city attorney, a man who'd entered the courtroom with a confident stride, now stood humbled, his shoulders slumped under the gravity of the truth. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all day, "the city withdraws all complaints, and I personally apologize to Mr. Harland." His words carried a sincerity that had surprised even himself, as if he, too, had been changed by the folder's revelations. Walter finally looked up, his eyes red but dry, glistening with the effort of holding back tears. He met the attorney's gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acceptance, not triumph. Inside, he felt a flicker of warmth, a quiet relief that the fight was over, at least for now. But the weight of the years, the weight of the names still pressed against his chest. As the gallery began to empty, the rustle of movement filled the air. People filed out slowly, some whispering in awe, others lost in thought. Among them was a young man, barely out of his teens, who'd been in the courtroom earlier, snickering with his friends during the proceedings. His laughter had been born of ignorance, a careless dismissal of the old man in the outdated uniform. Now his face was flushed with shame. He approached Walter hesitantly, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of his regret. "I didn't know." Walter looked at the young man, seeing not just a stranger, but a reflection of the boys he'd fought beside, the ones who never made it home. His grip was firm but gentle as he took the offered hand, his calloused fingers steadying the young man's trembling ones. "Now you do, son," he said softly, his voice rough but kind. "That's what matters." In that handshake, Walter felt a spark of hope, a sense that the story of those names might live on in this boy, in others like him. It was a moment that meant more than the judge's ruling, more than the applause or the headlines. It was the true verdict, the assurance that he and the men he'd fought for hadn't been forgotten. The next morning, the Klay County Tribune's front page screamed in bold capital letters, "Courtroom falls silent as true hero revealed." The headline was accompanied by a grainy photo of Walter, his uniform slightly askew, his eyes fixed on that distant point. For Walter, the paper was just ink and words, a fleeting moment of recognition. But for the town, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of the sacrifices etched into the stone at Memorial Grove Park. The monument would stand, and with it, the names of the fallen, unfading, unyielding, unforgettable. In a faded photograph, Walter Harland stood ramrod straight, his old military uniform crisp despite its years, his hand raised in a salute that seemed to hold the weight of decades. The courtroom around him was a frozen tableau of astonishment, faces caught mid-gasp, eyes wide with a reverence that had been absent for far too long. Walter, a man whose name had once been a punchline in the small town, had become a symbol of something greater, his quiet strength reshaping perceptions in an instant. By midday, the news of his stand had raced through the streets, outpacing the morning mail carriers. People whispered in diners, shared posts on their phones, and by dusk, veteran groups across the state had spread the story online, each share amplifying the quiet awe that now clung to Walter's name. Strangers, who once might have passed him without a glance, now nodded with respect as he shuffled by, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. Shopkeepers, their faces softened with newfound warmth, pressed free cups of coffee into his hands, their smiles carrying gratitude they hadn't known they owed. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, curious about the old man with the stooped shoulders. And for once, those parents had a story worth telling, a story of sacrifice, of resilience, of a man who never let the world's indifference dim his duty. Walter's heart, weathered by years of loss and quiet resolve, swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow as he felt the town's gaze shift. He hadn't asked for their admiration, hadn't sought their applause. For him, it had always been about the names etched in stone, names that haunted his dreams and steadied his steps. Yet the weight of their recognition stirred something deep within him, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could still remember what mattered. Within days, the city council, bowing to a swell of public sentiment and Judge Langston's firm endorsement, scrapped their plans to bulldoze Memorial Grove for a new development. The decision wasn't just a reversal, it was a promise to restore the sacred space, to polish the monument until it gleamed with the honor it deserved. A ceremony was set, and Walter, though he'd never been one for fanfare, felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. This wasn't just about him, it was about the men and women whose names he'd guarded, the ones who never made it home. On a brisk Saturday morning, the air sharp with the scent of autumn leaves, veterans from across the region gathered at Memorial Grove. Some wore their uniforms, the fabric straining slightly over years of change, while others leaned on walkers or steadied themselves on the arms of comrades. The plaza buzzed with a quiet intensity, pride, memory, and a hard-earned sense of redemption. At the heart of it all stood the monument, its stone scrubbed clean, the names of the fallen now shimmering with fresh gold leaf. Flags fluttered in a gentle breeze, encircling the plaza like sentinels. A new plaque gleamed at the monument's base, its words a tribute to those who served and to this, like Walter, who never stopped standing watch. The mayor's speech was earnest, if a bit polished, and Judge Langston's words carried the weight of someone who'd seen truth unveiled in her courtroom. Even the city attorney, usually so guarded, spoke with a humility that surprised the crowd, admitting past oversights and pledging a renewed commitment to honor the town's heroes. But it was Walter who drew every eye. When his name echoed through the loudspeakers, he stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, flanked by EMT Graves, whose steady presence had been a quiet comfort in recent weeks, and his granddaughter Emily, whose eyes shone with pride and a touch of worry for her grandfather. Walter wore his old uniform, now meticulously tailored to fit his frame, the fabric carrying the faint scent of mothballs and memory. In his trembling hand he held a small pair of ribbon-cutting scissors, their blades glinting in the morning light. As he snipped the red ribbon, the crowd erupted in cheers, cameras flashing like fireflies. Walter's heart pounded, not from the noise or the attention, but from the weight of the moment. He didn't speak. Words had never been his way. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric, and pulled out a single red rose. Its petals were vibrant against the gray stone as he knelt, with some effort, to place it at the monument's base. Rising, he stood at attention, his back as straight as age would allow, and saluted. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime, of battles fought, friends lost, and promises kept. The crowd fell silent, not out of obligation but out of understanding. Some tributes don't need grand speeches or flashing headlines. Some heroes don't chase glory. They carry it in their quiet, unwavering steps. To the townsfolk, Walter had once been just an old man, his uniform wrinkled, his cane tapping a slow rhythm they mistook for frailty. They'd seen his tarnished medals, his faded patches, and dismissed him as a relic of a bygone era, not a warrior whose courage still burned bright. They'd been wrong, and the realization humbled them. Sometimes the ones we overlook most quickly are the ones who've borne the heaviest burdens. Sometimes a man with the bent shoulders once stood tall against a hail of bullets, his heart racing not with fear, but with determination. Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's a sacred vow to remember. Walter Harland had never craved praise or demanded attention. Week after week, he'd shown up at Memorial Grove, his eyes tracing the names carved into the stone, names of friends, of brothers in arms, of lives cut short. Each visit was a pilgrimage, a quiet act of devotion in a world that moved too fast, judged too harshly, and forgot too easily. His protest had never been about defiance or anger. It was about duty, about a promise he'd made long ago to men who could no longer speak for themselves. In that courtroom, with a single salute, he'd reminded a room full of skeptics, in a town beyond, that not all heroes wear capes or raise their voices. Some simply stand watch. their hearts heavy with names the rest of us might never know. And in that moment, as the crowd's cheers faded and the rose lay vivid against the stone, Walter's quiet courage became a beacon, a reminder that the smallest salute can carry the weight of a nation, and the man we call a relic might just be the one who saved us all.